His watch stopped when the killing started. Welcome to Agent Ash. I'm your host. Be part of this story. Drop a comment with your location. I always smile reading your thoughtful messages. Let's begin. It was one of those Oxford dusks that arrived without apology, cloaked in the thin veil of a drizzle too fine to justify an umbrella, too insistent to be ignored. The kind that softened the outlines of things. Spires, bicycles, regrets, until they all dissolved into the same damp blur of evening. I was standing at Radcliffe Square, nursing the dull pulse of claret behind the eyes and the faint ache that Wagner always leaves somewhere in the ribs. There are composers, I find, who rouse the blood. Wagner does something crueler. He invites you to believe in magnitude, then leaves you to reckon with your own smallness. The organ in Brasenose Chapel had been practicing something stubbornly Protestant. Tallis, perhaps, or Howells, though it barely mattered. It was the shape of the sound that reached me, not its name. Long vowels of harmony drifting through narrow cloisters and drifting back again, as if unsure whether to remain. A swan traced its aloof spiral on the Cherwell as I lit a cigarette and felt, not for the first time, that I was growing too old for mornings, and not old enough for evenings. The library lights blinked alive across the square, one by one, as if the building were remembering it had work to do. Somewhere, behind me, a student laughed. The brittle, untroubled kind of laughter that belongs to those for whom nothing has truly been at stake yet. And then the hour came. And didn't. It wasn't the kind of omission you could explain. Just a silence where a chime ought to have been, and wasn't. No echo from the tower, no solitary stroke marking the arrival of the hour. Only the continued drizzle, and the organ now wheezing its last note like an argument unresolved. I remember thinking, odd, not important, just odd. The way a missing footstep is odder than an extra one. It was the sort of thing that usually passed without consequence. Oxford has 100 clocks and none of them agree. But I suppose when you're alone often enough, the world begins to speak in smaller voices. Bells that fail to ring. Footsteps that don't follow. Letters that arrive without names. I was nearly back at the flat on Canal Street when the call came through. Not from the station, from someone in a crisper, more agitated register. The Master of Saint. Simeon's College, though he never quite introduced himself and I never quite asked. Old voices don't like interruption. He had received a letter, anonymous, of course, a single page, folded twice, the sort of thin parchment favoured by the over-educated and the over-careful. It had no signature, only a sentence. Look beneath the dean's rooms. Something will be waiting. I said something about pranksters, about nervous dons with too much time and too little distraction, but even as I said it, I remembered the bell. There's no logical connection, of course. Bells and letters and rivers and organ music, none of it fits. But I've never trusted logic entirely. Logic, after all, would have me believe that a bottle of claret and 4 hours of Wagner was an unwise decision for a Tuesday night. And yet there I was, half hungover, half drenched, and for reasons I still don't entirely understand, already walking back into the night. St. Simeon's College. That always felt like a quiet joke on Oxford's part. The real Simeon was a stylite, wasn't he? Lived on a pillar in the desert for 40 years, refused to come down. Said the air was clearer up there, that he could think. The porter eyed me warily, as they always do when you're not wearing a gown. I gave my name, and something flickered. Not recognition, perhaps, but the absence of surprise. He handed me a key. South staircase, 2nd floor, the dean's rooms. Empty for now, he said. The dean's been away in Toulouse, shouldn't be any disturbance. Just the dust, sir, and the smell. Smell? Damp. And something else. I asked, what sort of something else? But he only looked back at me and said he hadn't gone in. I held the key a moment longer than I needed to. The drizzle was thickening now, settling like old breath on the cobbles. Somewhere, deeper in the quad, a bell finally began to chime. Late, off-tempo, apologetic, 6 strokes, or 7. I didn't count. Instead, I walked up the staircase and opened the door. He was slumped like a man who had leaned too far into a prayer and fallen asleep between syllables. The lamp on the desk still burned with the faint gold hush of a late afternoon, reluctant to end. Outside, the rain had become a polite mist, trailing down the leaded panes like old thoughts refusing to dry. Renfrew, the Reverend Dr. Charles Renfrew, to be precise, had been something of an Oxford relic himself, the sort of man whose clerical collar looked not like a symbol of belief, but of tenure. Latinist, antiquarian, and one-time rowing cocks for the dark blues. He had kept his sermons short and his walks long, and his pupils in just enough fear to keep them from affection. The porter had let me in with that peculiar blend of officious reverence and the kind of unspoken shrug that men of his stripe reserve for sudden death. "Heart," he had muttered, tapping a yellowing folder from the college nurse. Mild complaint on the record, nothing dramatic, nothing overdue, just a body too used to silence that had finally settled into it. But the room said otherwise. I stood there for a while, longer than necessary. There's a certain pose to natural death, even in surprise. Something lax and unfinished. But this was tidy, deliberate. His hands were folded, his chair pushed back half an inch. And on the desk, as though placed there with care, the antique watch. I remembered it clearly. A retirement gift presented the year he handed over the deanery keys the first time, before his brief exile to Lincoln and his reluctant return. Gold, engraved, it had ticked always with a kind of stubborn elegance, but now it had stopped. The second hand hung suspended like a question left unanswered. 4:12. I asked the porter when the body had been found. "Just before 6, he said. "Tea untouched, the blinds already drawn." I didn't want to be involved, not really. It had the shape of finality, no bruises, no blood, no weapon, unless you counted time itself. But something about the angle of the watch nagged. Why place it so precisely, hands just so, if it had simply failed? I stepped around the desk and looked closer. The tea tray sat too neatly. 2 cups, one clean, one still faintly stained. Milk jug untouched, no lemon, a biscuit untouched, beginning to soften. 1 sugar dropped, and another beside it, half dissolved, like someone had hesitated. And then the envelope. Smudged, no address. Torn open badly as though nerves had rushed the gesture. The writing was dense, looping. I couldn't read much, but one word glimmered in the lamplight. Forgive. Not I forgive, nor forgive me, just forgive. As if the word itself had been offered up as both confession and penance. And then the scent. Subtle, like old furniture, or the crease of a well-worn overcoat, cigar smoke, unmistakably. But Renfrew, to my certain recollection, never touched the stuff. Pipes, yes, occasionally. But cigars, number, which meant someone else had sat here, someone who preferred their smoke imported and their presence unnoticed. I glanced once more at the stopped watch. 4:12. I thought of the bell that hadn't chimed, the silence that had arrived in its place. A coincidence, perhaps. But Oxford was a city stitched together by such coincidences. Ghosts that missed their appointments, bells that lost their voices. I should have left then, should have handed it off politely, to the constable now taking photographs without looking anyone in the eye. But I lingered, as one does when the room speaks in half-thoughts. It wasn't grief that hung there, not yet. It was arrangement, the tea, the watch, the word, forgive. I asked the constable, offhand, who had found him. He glanced up from his notebook. Porter. Said the door was unlocked, but that's not unusual. Dr. Renfrew didn't care for keys. No, I said, he preferred certainty. And then I turned back to the desk and stared once more at the second hand that refused to move. Evensong at St. Simeon's had always struck me as something more architectural than spiritual. Vaults of sound suspended beneath vaults of stone. That evening the choir sang Tallis as if each note had been brushed in gold leaf and left to dry on the cold air. I sat in the back, feeling the sort of hungover reverence reserved for dim cathedrals and difficult music, and wondered, not for the first time, whether faith was simply a more enduring species of nostalgia. It was, during the Nunc Dimittis that I saw her. She was seated alone in the front pew, one hand gloved and the other bare, resting lightly on the edge of the hymnal, as though even printed praise required caution. The scarf, mauve of all things, wrapped loosely around her neck, neither fashionable nor careless. Mauve has always struck me as the colour of memory just beginning to fade. Her posture was not mournful, not exactly. There was no fidget, no tremble, no glancing upward, as if to find the deceased tucked among the arches. But there was something else, attention perhaps, as if she were listening not to the choir, but to some unseen ripple beneath the notes. It was the look of someone who expects the silence to say more than the singing. After the service, I let the crowd drift past, mostly students, a few dons with thinning hair and thick overcoats, and I waited until she rose. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who had been inside many ancient buildings and had learned not to disturb the dust. A porter addressed her. "Dr. Lane, I believe?" And she nodded without smiling, a gesture that felt less like civility than punctuation. It was Lewis who found the name, Dr. Margaret Lane. Classicist. Recently returned from a year in Rome. Sabbatical, funded by a fellowship $2,000 for its own stationery. Publications on Ovid, I believe. Or perhaps Catullus. Some poet who liked to make love and make enemies in the same stanza. Lewis, as always, was more direct. Said she'd been close to Renfrew, that her name appeared twice in the Dean's appointment ledger the week before his death, though no formal record of collaboration remained. Lewis had a fondness for motive and a sharper fondness for women who looked like they'd read Cicero in the bath. I said nothing. I'd met her once, I now recalled, years ago, at a lecture on Augustan rhetoric in the senior common room. She'd challenged a point on moral degeneration with such exquisite indifference that the speaker had folded his notes mid-sentence. There was no flirtation in it, just clarity, the sort that unnerves. She had that Roman stillness, something composed of both pride and weariness, the sort of look that made you want to tell her a secret and then regret it immediately. Lewis asked the question, what if she and Renfrew were involved? I said, involved is a word that's come to mean too little and too much. People share libraries, Lewis. And silences. Still, something in her presence scratched at me. I thought again of the envelope, the word forgive, and the watch that had stopped, not of its own accord. Was there grief in her silence, or guilt, or something altogether more Roman, the cool detachment of those who've seen too much drama to perform any of it themselves? I found myself walking back toward the college, cigarette half lit, and wondering, not for the first time, whether affection was a distraction or a clue. I thought of Renfrew and the empty teacup. I thought of the word mauve and how rarely it appears in dreams. And I thought, absurdly, that if anyone had tampered with that watch, they'd have worn gloves. But only one. The high table at St. Simeon's was long, dark, and absurdly polished, the sort of wood that seemed to absorb conversation rather than reflect it. They served the port first, which struck me as a quiet confession of priorities. Dinner followed with the usual ecclesiastical reverence for roast and pudding, though the meat arrived overcooked and the wine underbreathed. I listened mostly. It's a habit that's made me both unpopular and useful. The dons did what dons do best. They buried meaning beneath layers of citation and fondly misremembered Latin. Renfrew, they said, had been a bastion, a man of order, of classical convictions and a most unbending sense of propriety, as if rigidity were a virtue best admired once it ceased to inconvenience the living. Only Toller, the Marxist historian with the mismatched cufflinks and wine-stained fingers, spoke with a note of divergence. He muttered something about orthodoxy masking fear, about how even saint Simeon's ivy couldn't cover every crack. But when I asked him later what precisely he meant, he waved a hand as if batting away a weak thesis, said only, "Oxford has its secrets, Morse, and some are older than our sins." He left early, claiming a lecture to prepare, though his notes remained beneath his seat. I noticed they were written on the back of last week's Guardian crossword. The others lingered, not out of joy, but inertia. A man had died. That allowed for toasts, but not sentiment. One of the junior fellows praised Renfrew's Latin versification, said his translation of Boethius read like dry rain. I asked what dry rain meant, but he only laughed, then forgot to stop. I excused myself before the pudding. The air in those rooms always turns to starch after an hour. You can feel your lungs stiffen with precedent. Renfrew's private library, just off the deanery, had the quiet of a confession booth and the smell of books that hadn't been opened in decades. Mahogany shelves, glass-fronted and locked, though not all of them. He'd left one volume open on the reading table, spine strained flat as if protesting. A Loeb edition of Tacitus, its Latin mercilessly interleaved with English, lay mid-paragraph. But it wasn't the book that held my attention, it was the library slip, tucked beneath the open pages, not as a marker, but as an anchor, a soft wedge to keep the text displayed as if awaiting return, was a standard request slip from the college archive, pale green, corners folded, a signature at the bottom, neat and steady. D. Evans. I paused. The name meant nothing. No such student appeared in the registry. I checked before leaving. No record in the Bodleian system either. I ran the name past Lewis the following morning. He suggested with typical bluntness that perhaps it was a pseudonym or a pun. Evans, as in evening, balance. I said nothing but felt the old weight of something near. Renfrew was not a man who read fiction. If a name sat in his book, it had purpose, a request for a text. But the slip gave no title, just the name, no date, no shelf code. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to be remembered, or misremembered. Outside, the quad had gone cold. Lights shimmered on wet flagstone, and the cathedral bells, late again, tolled the half hour. A student raced across the grass, heedless of tradition, chased by nothing but rain. Back inside, I stood over the Tacitus and read the final line left open. Corruptissima Republica, plurimae leges. The more corrupt the state, the more laws it has. Perhaps it wasn't grief that had kept them silent at dinner. Perhaps it was fear, not of death, but of what it had disturbed. I folded the slip, placed it in my coat, and left the book open, as it had been, letting Tacitus watch the door as I closed it behind me. The chapel organist was younger than I remembered. Or perhaps I was simply older now, in the way that ages you, not by years, but by how many evenings you've spent watching. Silence moved through a place meant for sound. He had a long face, made longer by the weight of unsaid things, and his hands, soft, pale, rested awkwardly on the keys, like a man unsure whether to pray or flee. I caught him between services, the air still thick with incense and overtones. I asked whether Doctor. Renfrew had seemed himself in his final days. He hesitated, then played a single chord. Minor, unresolved, a kind of answer. He said softly that the dean had lost something, not his faith, but perhaps his precision. That he'd grown more brittle, as if the structures he'd once built his days around no longer held. Then after a pause he added that the night before Renfrew died there had been a scene. Not loud, but not forgettable. With Adam, he said. Young Petrie, one of our trebles. What about? It was personal. He meant it to end there, but something, guilt perhaps, or the memory of a note sung out of tune, made him continue. Renfrew had said something unkind, not about music, about the boy's affections. Adam had cried, and then hadn't come to rehearsal the next morning. He was fond of someone, I think. And Renfrew was cruel about love. I found Adam Petrie not in the choir loft or the quad, but by the river's edge, tossing pebbles at nothing. The kind of boy who still wore his blazer even when no one was watching, and whose hands were always stuffed too deep into his pockets, as if afraid of what they might do if left unsupervised. He recognized me at once, didn't run, just looked down and said, "I didn't do anything. I told him I knew that." "Then why are you asking?" "Because sometimes the truth comes out sideways. And I don't think you've had anyone ask you straight on." He didn't speak for a while, just flicked a stone too short and watched the ripple fail to reach the far bank. He said, finally, "That doctor." Renfrew didn't like ambiguity, that he wanted the world to be precise, labelled, arranged, catalogued, in Latin if possible. He said that love made things untidy, that it should be put away before it started rotting the corners. Did he say that to you? Number. But he meant it. Then he added, barely audible, "I told him something, about someone I cared about. He said it was indecent, not the act, the impulse. Said it would ruin the music." "And what did you say?" "I said that maybe the music had started because of it. That was all he gave me, and maybe it was more than he meant to." I left him there by the water, still looking for stones worth throwing. Back in the flat, the post had arrived. 3 bills, a flyer for a lecture on medieval hymnals, and the Oxford Mail. I turned to the crossword automatically, like a man checking his pulse. Clue of the day, centre square. Faith ends in ruin, but music begins again. 12 letters. I circled it. There are some phrases that feel borrowed from elsewhere, like they've wandered from someone else's day and turned up in yours by mistake, or by design. I stared at the clue longer than it deserved. It didn't fit yet, but something in it hummed. The same off-note I'd heard in the organist's answer, in Adam's silence, in the unmoved tea and the stopped watch. Music, after all, is memory wrapped in discipline. And when discipline breaks, what's left sings louder than it ought to. I penciled in resurrection. It fit the spaces, but not the sense. Then I looked again at the clue and thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the ruin isn't at the end of faith, but at its beginning. Solicitors have a way of speaking that suggests time is something that can be invoiced. Mr. Brackley, silver-haired, rimless glasses, a voice like dry parchment, offered tea, declined sugar, and unfolded the document as if it might confess without prompting. It was, he said, an informal revision, no witnesses, no date, no signature, just 4 pages in Renfrew's tight, angular hand, clipped together with a rusting pin and left in a folder labelled "To be finalised." The phrasing was precise, unmistakably his. A codicil, really, most of it harmless, until the final paragraph. A bequest, substantial enough to raise an eyebrow even among Oxford's old families, to a student, unnamed, described only as in hardship through no fault of their own. The tone was uncharacteristically warm, almost apologetic, as if the money were not a gift, but an amendment. I asked who the student was. Brackley removed his glasses and cleaned them unnecessarily. There is no record, no attached note, no preliminary list, nothing in the bursary files. Then why write it? Why indeed? He didn't forget the signature, I said. That wasn't his habit. Brackley nodded slowly. Dr. Renfrew was many things. Forgetful wasn't one of them. So what are we looking at? A message, perhaps, or a gesture? Something meant to be found, not enacted, something private, I thought, or perhaps something postponed too long. The old will stood, of course, safe, filed, witnessed, quietly conservative, a small amount to the cathedral, a few legacies to cousins whose names sounded more historical than personal, the rest to the college, order preserved. But the new will, the one that wasn't, hung in the air like a cord, unresolved. I walked the quad again that evening, hands deep in my coat, the drizzle returning with the discretion of habit. I found Margaret Lane beneath the arch outside the chapel, watching the rain collect in the creases of the old stone. She said, without looking at me, "You've seen the draft, haven't you?" "Yes." "Did he tell you?" "Number." "Then it wasn't for you." I asked who it was for. She didn't answer. I waited. After some time, she said he spoke often of correcting something, not an error, a wrong. There's a difference. One's mechanical, the other is lived. What sort of wrong, he never told me, but you knew, not the details, just the tone. He had a way of repenting that felt like scholarship, quiet, precise, endlessly revised. I asked her again who the student might be. She turned then, slowly, her eyes resting too long on the chapel doors, where the paint had begun to flake in patterns that resembled leaves or wounds. "There was a boy once," she said. "Years ago. He wasn't suited to the place, too honest, too proud. Renfrew saw something in him. Talent, I think, but also vulnerability. That made him nervous. So he kept him close, then pushed him away. What happened to him? He left. Quietly, without finishing. There was talk, but nothing ever stated. You think it's him? I think guilt grows in silence. And you? I did what I was paid to. I taught him Latin. He taught me something else. I wasn't brave enough to listen properly. The bell began to toll. 7, I think, though I lost count after the third. It echoed differently tonight, as though the tower itself had shifted a fraction. Before I left, I asked her what she believed the bequest was meant to do. "Forgive," she said, "or at least allow the illusion of it." "And you think he forgot the signature?" "No, Inspector. I think he wanted to be forgiven, but not enough to deserve it." I walked away before she changed her mind. The rain had stopped, though the stones still wept. In the porter's lodge, a clock ticked 3 seconds fast, or 3 seconds hopeful. That night I read the unsigned will again. He had written the word light in the margin beside the name. A correction, yes, but also, perhaps, a confession. The college archive was tucked behind the old buttery, down a staircase that creaked with the sort of complaint only stone can manage after centuries of being stepped on by men who believed they were making history. It smelt of dust and catalogued, carelessness, paper foxed and forgotten, files tied with sun-bleached ribbon, memories curled at the edges. I was looking for something else initially. Minutes from a governing body meeting in 73, a half-formed hunch about scholarships and silences. Instead, I found the box marked College Societies, Dramatic, Classical, Miscellaneous, tucked beneath a playbill for the Bacchae and a wine-stained program from an undergraduate performance of Antigone. There it lay. A photograph from 1972, black and white, glossy only where time hadn't smudged it. The Greek Drama Society. I stared at it longer than I should have. There was Renfrew, younger, yes, but unmistakable. That angular nose, the clerical solemnity, even in youth, a man incapable of costume, even among Dionysian masks. He stood unsmiling, a faint frown threading between his brows, as if tragedy were not just a genre but a private condition. Beside him, one name scribbled in blue ink beneath the image, Dominic Evans. The hand that wrote it had paused slightly over the surname, as though reluctant to finish the sentence. A student of English, expelled before the end of his 3rd year. The college records list conduct incompatible with academic standing, which is Oxford's way of saying nothing and everything. There was space for another figure in the photo, a shoulder just visible, a sliver of a sleeve, but the rest had been torn away, not cut, not folded, torn, ragged edge, white, fibrous wound where someone had once been. Whatever had stood between them had been removed with haste, if not cruelty. I held the photograph by its edges, unwilling to touch its surface, as though the heat of my fingers might stir some buried unease. Dominic Evans, the name on the library slip, the ghost in Renfrew's unread bequest, the anonymous burden. There are 2 kinds of secrets at Oxford, the kind so old they've turned to myth, and the kind so near they haven't found words yet. This felt like both, the past pressing into the present, not with revelation, but with the slow pressure of rot beneath floorboards. I didn't tell Lewis what I'd found, not yet. Some knowledge isn't meant to be passed on until it's fully turned, like cheese or grief. That night I walked. Oxford was still. Rain had come and gone, leaving the streets slick with reflection. Lamplight and memory trailing each other across the stones. The air was cool, not cold. The kind that asks you to remember someone, whether you want to or not. I passed under Radcliffe Camera's dome and listened to the wind move through the ironwork of the gates. I thought of Renfrew, of the unsigned will, the halted watch, the tea left cooling beside an open envelope. I thought of Margaret Lane's silence, of Adam Petrie's bruised eyes, of music begun in sorrow and ended in shame. But mostly I thought of the photograph, of what had been removed, of what had remained. I remembered, as one does when walking with too many, thoughts, a line from Aeschylus, something I'd once underlined in a translation I never finished. The memory of evil shall not die, not be avenged, not be resolved, simply not die. It returns, it rearranges itself in the present. It peers out from torn edges and library slips and the quiet refusal of bells to strike. Back in the flat, I placed the photograph on the table and turned it toward the window, as if the city might look in and tell me what to see. But the glass only reflected myself. Older, yes, but unmistakable. And the half-light of a question not yet ready to be answered. Confessions, when they come, rarely arrive dressed in certainty. More often, they wear panic. Loose, misfitting, stitched hastily by fear. That afternoon, Adam Petrie came to me not with a statement, but a shiver, damp at the collar and trembling at the edges, as though whatever he carried inside him had begun to leak into the light. We sat in the chapel vestry. An odd choice, his, but perhaps deliberate, a place where truth once had ritual. The rain outside tapped gently against the stained glass as though reluctant to intrude. He didn't sit. He stood by the narrow wooden chair but never claimed it. Just looked at it, then at me, and began. He said the dean had found out. About him. About someone else. A boy whose name he wouldn't give, though I suspected I already knew, that Renfrew had summoned him to the study 2 days before his death, said the word conduct, said reputation, said the word unnatural not as an accusation, but as doctrine. Adam's voice cracked, not with grief, but exhaustion. He said he'd begged, said he hadn't touched anyone, that it had only been letters, glances, silence, thick with meaning. He said the dean had told him silence was no longer an option, that the college would act. And then, in a whisper so fragile I could scarcely be sure it had left his mouth, he said he put something in the tea. It was his own, he said, a powder from a bottle he'd stolen from his mother's bathroom cabinet. Something to calm nerves, something that slowed the heart. He'd crushed it, waited, slipped it into the milk jug, but the dean's cup, the one I'd examined so closely, had remained full, the sugar only half dropped. No milk, no sipped rim, no trace, the tea untouched. I told him that. He blinked, once, as though the facts themselves had betrayed him. Then he said, "But I meant to." I looked at him and saw something more dangerous than guilt, the need for punishment in the absence of crime. The post-mortem had been plain. Myocardial infarction, heart failure, nothing added, nothing induced. His body had given out the way some books do, not because they're mishandled, but because the spine was always going to give. And yet Adam's fear was not false. It clung to him, not like dew, but like smoke, the kind that settles into fabric and refuses to wash out. I told him again, the tea was untouched, that he had done nothing, not in action, but intention is something else, isn't it? He nodded, eyes red, lips trembling. Then he said something that caught me, gently, in the ribs. He said, "I didn't want him dead, I wanted him silent." I didn't answer, because somewhere behind his words lay a deeper truth, not about murder, but about shame. Not his, someone else's. Passed down, dressed up as tradition, enforced by men who'd long forgotten what it was they were trying to protect. I walked him back across the quad, slow, careful. The sky was clearing, but not with conviction. Just the way Oxford skies do, regretfully. He looked smaller in daylight. Boys always do after they've confessed to sins they didn't commit. In the lodge, I paused. I asked him one last thing. When you were there, in the dean's study, did you see anyone leave before you arrived? He hesitated. Then, no, but the window was open and I smelled something strange. What kind? Smoke, but not cigarette. Thicker, perfume maybe. Bitter. Cigar, I said. He nodded. I let him go. The truth was close now, not in Adam's guilt, but in the absence of someone else's, in the signature never made, the photo torn, the name that slipped itself quietly into a book. Confessions can be false, but shame? Shame always tells the truth, eventually. You just have to listen to what it doesn't say. There are moments when meaning arrives not with a shout, but with a misstep. A pause where none belongs. A note sung a fraction sharp. A word out of place that echoes louder because it shouldn't be there at all. I returned to the chapel not for belief. I'd long since stopped expecting revelation from architecture, but because music remembers things people forget. The choir was rehearsing Stanford in B-flat, that polite, upward-lifting sort of Anglican praise, half floating in the air like dust in amber light. I sat in the back pew beneath the cold stone ribs of the ceiling and tried not to think. Margaret Lane stood near the front, holding a battered copy of the Book of Common Prayer. She wasn't reading to the choir, just murmuring aloud as if the words might mean more, said quietly. Then she spoke a verse, familiar, liturgical, dependable. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not mercy. I stopped. Mercy? Not charity? The line hung oddly in the air. She hadn't corrected herself, hadn't even blinked, just turned the page and moved on as if nothing had tilted. But something had. Mercy, not charity. The crossword clue surfaced. Faith ends in ruin, but music begins again. I'd dismissed it as thematic coincidence, but it hadn't sat right, and now it didn't sit at all. It shifted, lined up with other things that hadn't sat right. The will, unsigned, the missing student, the smudged envelope, the scent of cigar smoke in a room where no one smoked. Mercy, not charity. I left before the rehearsal ended, walked briskly back to my flat and pulled the library slip from the file. D. Evans. I'd held it for days, and for days it had meant only one thing: the absent student, the expelled, the erased. But now it meant her, Margaret Lane. The correction in her voice hadn't been accident. It had been code, a small linguistic sleight of hand. Mercy was personal. It asked for understanding. Charity, but that was the college's word, the institutional alibi for kindness. I poured a whiskey and stared again at the name. Dominic Evans. There had been no public scandal, of course. Oxford rarely produces those. Just the quiet bureaucratic excision of a name. And when it had been done, Renfrew had kept the silence intact, like a pressed flower in an unread book. But Margaret remembered. She had not forgiven. She had once loved him. That much was clear now, not from anything she'd said, but from everything she hadn't. I saw it now in the way her hand lingered on the pew rail, in the half-smile she gave the choristers who sang slightly out of tune. She had once risked affection in a place that preferred abstraction, and Renfrew, meticulous, devout, devoted to order, had ended it, quietly, thoroughly. He had found out, perhaps by accident, a letter left open, a rehearsal missed. He had pulled rank as men like him do, not with force, but with principle. Principles are sharper than knives when wielded by men who believe they've never erred. Dominic was gone. Margaret stayed. I imagine she believed she could do more good inside than out. But that sort of compromise curdles. The new will, the unsigned one, had not been a gesture of charity. It had been mercy. Late, clumsy, cowardly mercy. A thing offered too long after it was needed. And she had known. She had seen it there on the desk, the words, the sum, the name withheld. She had read it and left it unsigned. Or perhaps she had found it that way. Perhaps she had only watched as he drafted it, knowing he would hesitate. But she had come back to Oxford, returned from Rome not for the lectures nor the archives, for the reckoning. I stood at the window then, drink in hand, and watched the city soften beneath the drizzle. Bells tolled late again, perhaps by minutes, perhaps by decades. There are crimes and there are corrections, but there are also silences so deep they hum like music in an empty chapel. Mercy, not charity. Now I understood. It was the watch that brought me back. Not its silence, but the numbers it displayed so faithfully, as if still keeping time for a man already gone. 4:12. I'd stared at it a dozen times, considered poison, timing, alibi, but not meaning, not until now. I was reading idly, more to steady the mind than seek a conclusion, when the verse rose from the page like a submerged stone, breaking the surface. Romans chapter 4, verse 12. And the Father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith. The rest faded. The shape of the sentence enough to still the air. Renfrew had not been careless. He had not simply stopped winding the watch. He had left a verse, a theological rebuke, wrapped in precision. He was a scholar to the end. Even in death, he footnoted his departure. It was a message only someone who read Scripture the way others read motive would notice, a passage about boundaries, about those who are excluded and those who believe, a verse as razor-edged as Renfrew's own morality, and perhaps an afterthought of doubt. I took the Bible from my shelf, the King James, naturally, and ran a finger down the verse again, who also walk in the steps of that faith. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession written in code. By late evening I was at Margaret Lane's door. She answered without surprise, as if she'd been expecting the knock for days. The rooms behind her smelled faintly of paper, lemon peel, and an older perfume that had long since lost its name. She offered wine without asking. Red, full-bodied. The sort you pour only when the conversation has no escape route. I told her about the verse. She listened. Then she said softly, I confronted him that day. I said nothing. Not to harm him, Morse, just to speak, to say it plainly for once, what he had done, what it had cost. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that it might make him human again, to hear it aloud. Did it? She sipped, swallowed slowly. He didn't deny it, not the act, just the reason. Said the college had no room for indulgence. That duty required sacrifice. He used that word twice, sacrifice, and then he seemed shaken, not outwardly, but something in him had frayed. He asked me to leave, said he needed time to put something right. Did you see anyone? She hesitated. The glass trembled slightly in her hand. Yes. Who? Tola. Tola, the atheist, the Marxist, the contrarian in a world of rules, and, I remembered now, once the tutor, to a certain young man who had vanished from the college without record or kindness, Dominic Evans. Lane's eyes dropped. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. He knew? I asked. Toller was the one who took Dominic in after, for a while, helped him find work, encouraged the writing. He called it grief in disguise. What happened? 3 years ago, I heard it from an old friend. Dominic died, suicide. Quietly, alone, a flat near Reading, and Renfrew knew only after. That, she said, was when the sermons changed. I stared at my glass but didn't drink. The silence between us grew dense, not accusatory, just tired. You think Toller confronted him? Yes. Do you think he... No, she looked up sharply. Not that, but something passed between them. A final reckoning, perhaps. An old radical and a tired priest, both standing in the ruins of their beliefs. One trying to atone, the other refusing to let him. Outside, the chapel bells rang. This time, they were almost on the hour. I left without another word. 4:12. Not a time, a verse, a wound disguised as scholarship. Renfrew had not been killed, he had been confronted by a woman he wronged, by a man who remembered, by a past that refused to close its book. And the faith he clung to, it had, at last, asked something of him he could not meet. It had been there the whole time, the watch, the hands frozen at 4:12, and I, like everyone else, had looked only for the obvious. Time of death, alibi, sequence. But some men do not mark their exits with time, they do it with scripture. I'd gone back to the flat, restless and rudderless, and pulled out a volume I rarely opened anymore, Romans 4:12, the reference, the riddle. I ran my finger down the page, slowly, as if the weight of the meaning would shift as I read, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith. It stopped me, even before the final clause. There was nothing casual here. It was a rebuke. Not outward, not loud, but chosen. A verse about boundaries and belonging, about those who do not fit but still follow. Renfrew had left this. He who had always insisted on grammar over grace, structure over softness, had reached for a verse like this. He had not misjudged the time. He had assigned it. The watch was not a clock. It was an epitaph. Later, in Margaret Lane's rooms, the rain tapping the sill, like someone who'd forgotten how to knock, I told her. She poured wine without asking, as if she knew this was a conversation meant to loosen something long knotted. Yes, she said, he would do that. Leave theology where others left footprints. And he knew I would read it. He always assumed I would still be listening. Were you? Not always, but that day, yes. You confronted him? She nodded. Her hand around the glass stayed very still. I told him I knew about Dominic, about what he had done, what he'd ended. I told him he had turned faith into cruelty and called it policy. And he? He didn't shout, didn't deny it, just folded his hands. He said he had tried to preserve the college's integrity, that some sacrifices are private and some are required. And you believed him? I believed he believed himself. She paused. Then, but he was shaken. Something cracked. You could feel it. Was he alone when you left? Number. Who? Tola. He was waiting in the cloister. I passed him, didn't speak. But the look on his face, I knew. Tola, the loudest atheist in Oxford. The man who had written a monograph on institutional repression and been ignored for it. The man who had once, years ago, mentored a student named Dominic Evans. A boy expelled in silence, never publicly named, never publicly mourned. Dominic had died 3 years ago. A small flat. A final note, unsent. I never asked if Renfrew knew. I didn't need to. Guilt has a shape, and Renfrew had worn it in the last weeks like a tailored coat. Tola had gone to him not with violence, but with memory. And that, I suspect, was worse. Margaret watched the rain streak down the glass, her voice low. Tola was never dangerous, not in the way people think. But he never forgot. He'd taught Dominic, believed in him, fought for him, even after the door was shut. Did he threaten Renfrew? I don't know, but I think he made him see. I said nothing. Some deaths are not murders, but they are not natural either. They are the final consequence of being seen, fully, finally, by someone you once made invisible. Back in the flat, I turned over the photograph again, the torn edge, the missing figure, the half-smile on Renfrew's younger face, as if already haunted by a choice he hadn't yet made. 4:12. It was not a moment. It was a mirror. A verse handed down like a last confession to those who still walk in the steps of that faith, even if they no longer believe. Renfrew had believed to the end. But belief, I've learned, is not the same as mercy. It was Lewis, of course, who finally unearthed the footage. A grainy sliver of the past etched in monochrome pixels from a camera too old to care. The quad, late afternoon, rain stippling the flagstones, a figure moving steadily beneath the arch, hunched, unreadable, coat pulled high like a monk late to prayer. Tola. The timestamp read 4:15. A librarian might argue margin of error. I do not. Time, in this case, was not just a measure. It was motive's shadow. He'd given a reason when pressed. Said he had returned a book to Renfrew. Something borrowed weeks prior, a volume of Cicero, naturally. He said it as though the words might disappear into their own pretense. But the medical report told its own story: heightened cardiac stress, adrenal overload, the body's slow betrayal. The dean's heart had not failed of its own accord. It had been nudged by memory, by shame, by the final, unbearable clarity of being known. I found Tola near the Bodleian, nursing a black coffee and the remains of a Guardian crossword. He didn't resist the approach. He rarely did. I told him what we'd seen. He nodded. Didn't even feign surprise. Yes, I went, around 4, or just after. I was going to leave the book at his door, but he was in. You spoke? I did. What did you say? Only the truth, that Dominic had died, that it was Renfrew's doing, even if he'd wrapped it in doctrine and policy and all the blessed silk of tradition, that he had taken a boy, a bright, careful, complicated boy, and taught him how to vanish. His voice didn't rise. It never did. Even his rage wore spectacles. I didn't touch him, Morse, I swear that. I only told him, I said his mercy had come too late, that the unsigned will was a kind of cowardice, a confession he hoped someone else would read for him. And what did he say? Nothing. Not at first. Just sat there. I thought he'd throw me out, but he didn't. He looked not angry, just old, as if everything had finally caught up with him. Tola paused, staring into the cooling dark of his coffee. He said he'd meant to write to Dominic, had even drafted it once, but never sent it. He said, I thought silence might be kinder. He looked at me then, and I told him, silence is what killed him. And then I left. He didn't stop me. You're sure? Yes, but you lingered only for a moment outside. It was raining again. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the college bells would be late. Again? And the watch? Ah, he looked at me carefully, a man both ready and unwilling to admit something not criminal, but damning all the same. I heard it. You heard it? Yes, that was the worst part. I stepped outside and heard it tick, just faintly, from behind the door, like it had started again, or had never stopped. I don't know. But I heard it. And yet when I arrived, it was silent. Yes. That silence, I thought, may have said more than any noise ever could. Tola had left the room alive, but his words had done what no hand could. They had pulled Renfrew's final defense out from under him, left him seated upright, still breathing, until he wasn't. Tola stood. I didn't kill him, Morse, number. But you were the last man he heard. He said nothing. Some truths arrive not with shouts or accusations, but with footsteps. One pair entering, one leaving, too late to stop, too early to undo, and somewhere between them, a ticking that wasn't there, or had been, or only pretended to be. Because silence, when deliberate, makes the loudest confession of all. The inquest was brief, clean, clinical, and as such things go, politely evasive. Natural causes. The phrase arrived like a rubber stamp. No further questions, no footnotes. The dean, it was decided, had died of the thing so many fear, himself. They didn't mention the unsigned will, or the unfiled report from the bursar's office about a scholarship that never quite reached its recipient. No one asked why the watch had stopped, or why the sugar hadn't stirred, or what scent still lingered, faint and accusatory, in the fabric of the dean's study armchair. I didn't contest it. Some truths are too heavy for courtrooms. That afternoon I sat in the quad, the sunlight low and uneven, falling through the cloister in narrow bars of light, like the slats of a half-forgotten memory. A copy of Aeschylus lay open in my lap. Not for study, not for nostalgia, just to hold something older than guilt. The Greek bent and curled on the page, unread and unrepentant. I sipped coffee that had long since gone tepid and watched a single leaf wobble downward from the chestnut tree. It reached the ground without event. Not everything that falls makes a sound. Margaret Lane approached without ceremony. She wore a grey coat, the same mauve scarf tucked under the collar. She looked older today, though not tired. She stood beside the bench for a moment before sitting, carefully, as if taking her leave even before speaking. "It's done then," she said. "Yes. They ruled it natural. They
Did. And you believe that? I believe he died of what he'd become. Whether that's nature or nurture, I couldn't say. She nodded. A breeze tugged lightly at the edge of her scarf, and I noticed a single thread frayed near her collarbone. So much we never see until we're close enough to leave. "I've resigned," she said softly. "I'll be returning to Rome." "You'll miss the weather," I said. She smiled, not at the jest, but at the distance I maintained even in parting. I think I stayed too long. I believed I could preserve something, redeem it even, but Oxford does not wish to be redeemed. It wishes to be remembered. "What will you do?" She shrugged. "Translate, walk, forget, or try to." "And him? Dominic?" "Yes, he walks with me still. Not as a ghost, just as a silence that doesn't leave when the music ends." I didn't respond. What could I say? I had walked beside my own silences for years, some of them with names I barely remembered, others with faces I could not forget. She stood. "He was a good student," she said, "bright, generous, and deeply lonely." That was the part Renfrew never understood. That loneliness, when punished, becomes something else, something that does not forgive. I met her gaze, but not her eyes. I never could, not fully. She offered her hand. I shook it. "Take care, Inspector, and you?" She turned. Her footsteps made no echo across the flagstones. The door to the quad clicked shut behind her with a softness that felt more final than any speech. And then the bell. It came without warning, a single chime, late, off-key. As if someone had remembered too late that the hour had passed and rung it anyway, out of habit, more than hope. I closed the book. Somewhere beneath the murmuring stone of Oxford, something had moved, not enough to wake the dead, but enough perhaps to remind the living. I spoke aloud, though no one was near to hear me. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. The Yeats line hung in the air a moment, then vanished, like music, like memory, like mercy, too long withheld. And then the silence returned, not peaceful, not heavy, just patient, waiting as ever for the next sound to mean something.